Michael quoted a Paul Simon line there of diamonds on the soles of our shoes. As I was coming up this morning, I was thinking more of slip sliding away. So it's great to see so many people here, particularly the conditions that we encountered this morning in the trip. Look, I've got a couple of slides. Actually, Justin told me earlier that Kevin finished early, so he was going to give me 10 minutes rather than 5. And then Michael used up my 5, so I'm back to 5 minutes. So as a good Kerryman, I'm going to talk as quickly as possible. Quotas are coming off. Will you make more money from milk, or will you make more milk from money? Because quite often I see it as being the latter. And what I particularly want to focus on is the New Zealand experience. So I spent the last 15 years in New Zealand, and have been very, very fortunate to have been mentored by some of the best farmers in the world in New Zealand, Australia, UK, Ireland, and in the US and in South America as well. And I count myself very fortunate for that. But I've learned an awful lot from them. And what you're facing down into post-April the 1st is a decision, as Michael pointed out. What do I do? Will I produce more milk, and how will I produce that much milk? And in New Zealand, we've seen a sea change in the system of farming that most of you would have associated with New Zealand probably since 2006, since the lift in milk prices in 2006. And there's plenty of vested interests to support the changes that we've seen, and I'll show you some of them in a second. But there's also plenty of research evidence. This is some research evidence actually from the company that I work for, or one of the companies that I work for in New Zealand, Dairy NZ. And what it shows is on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, is your different systems of farming, from low input through to high input. And different milk prices are the different colors of line. And so you can see that a low to moderate input system is both profitable and resilient. So resilient means it survives the downturn, and profitable means it can take advantage of the upswing. And so there's been a drive to increase the amounts of inputs that are put into New Zealand dairy farms. And this is just an example of it from 2008 to 2013. The blue bar is 2008, the red bar is 2013, and on the bottom again is the intensification of our systems. And what you can see is a real decline in the number of systems that are either self-sustaining or with very low levels of inputs being purchased in, and a very rapid increase over the space of 5 years of systems that are incorporating a large amount of supplements. So what does that mean? So I'm not going to compare high input systems versus low input systems. What I want to show you is what's happened in New Zealand in the last decade. So in the last decade, we've produced about 55% more milk. We've brought about 25% more land into dairying, and we've brought about 35% more cows into dairying. Now, if you do the math on that, 55% more milk from 25% more land, obviously, we're producing more milk per hectare. And 55% more milk from 35% more cows, we're producing more milk per cow. And so there's been an enormous lift in revenue on the average dairy farm, and this is the average dairy farm in New Zealand. So we've gone from about $400,000 revenue to about $1 million revenue, New Zealand dollars. Our costs have followed suit. Now, many would argue, well, you've got to spend money to make money, and free cash has increased as well, so all is good. I mean, it's the Cinderella story. We found our prince. But what would have happened if we did nothing? If we just stayed milking 300 cows, we hadn't expanded to 400 cows. Well, obviously, our revenue would be nowhere near as much. We're milking less cows, we're producing less milk, we wouldn't be getting the same revenue. If we'd allowed our costs to increase with inflation, if we had stayed disciplined to the system of farming that was tried and true and proven in New Zealand before that, our free cash would have been very, very similar. So just to show you that in a much more simple graph, our revenue currently in the real situation is sitting close to $1 million at an average milk price, which we're now below, obviously. If we had stayed farming 300 cows like we were doing it 10 years ago, our revenue would be closer to 650,000. Our costs have increased to, our costs are currently sitting around $750,000. In the status quo scenario, they would have sat at 400,000. And so there's absolutely no difference in the free cash at the end of the day. And what that means is that the average New Zealand dairy farmer is producing 40% more milk and making no more money than they would have been doing if they'd stayed farming the way they are. Now, as you face into an expansion environment, this is something you need to be aware of. Will you make more money from milk? Will you make more money from additional milk? Why is that? All right, well, if we look at the expenses, and this is to prove to you that that inflation line is actually real. This is what's happened to costs in New Zealand over the last decade. Just a standard inflationary adjustment in overheads. a standard inflationary adjustment in animal health, a standard inflationary adjustment in depreciation. We did see a hike in fertilizer prices, just like you guys did in 2006 when oil prices went through the roof. We should see that come back a bit in the next 12 months, hopefully. And labour, again, not even keeping pace with inflation. What really drove our costs in New Zealand was a massive hike in 2007 in feed prices, our feed price per kilo of milk solids. And with that, we saw an increase in maintenance and running costs. Now, why that's important is, you will, post-April the 1st, you will hear from a lot of people, well, you've got to spend money to make money. If you put in feed and use it sensibly, you'll make money from it. But if you look at our increase in expenses, so this was our increase in feed expenses over the last decade. You look at our change to cow numbers, it comes nowhere near our increase in feed expenses. Now, if you compare it, of course, to our milk price, you can see a very, very strong relationship. So I travelled the world for 5 years espousing the business virtues of New Zealand dairy farmers, only to be proven in 2007 that they were as easy to separate from their money as any other farmer that I'd met in the world. So just to bear that in mind. Now, I'm tempering the expansion drive here. I'm saying, do you need to milk more cows? Well, of course, you'd be stupid not to. We've been hamstrung, we've been spancelled for the last 30 years, and someone's taken the kick bar off us on April the 1st. What you don't want to be, though, is the proverbial April Fool. I'm going to ask you the question. It's a question my father asked me. About 7 or 8 years ago, when I knew everything, I went developing farms in North America with a bunch of other people and found how little I knew, actually. But I remember as we developed it, and I got caught up in the bragging rights, the ego of scale, as Mike has talked about, the vanity of milk production per cow. I was talking about how many cows we were going to milk, and we'd be milking 10,000 cows by probably 2015, actually. And my father, quietly and calmly, brought me back down to earth. He said, "You've only one family to feed. How many cows do you need to milk?" And it was an incredible comment, as simply put as it was. I have only one family to feed. How many cows do I need to milk? The reason why I'm asking you that question is, if you look at the statistics of the Irish dairy industry, the average dairy farmer by 2020 will have to milk about 180 cows to earn the average national wage. The top third of Irish dairy farmers will have to milk 115, and the top 10% of Irish dairy farmers will have to milk 60. There's a 200% difference in operating efficiency between the average dairy farmer, the average, and the top 10%. You must have skill before scale. Taking a poorly performing business into expansion on debt, it will be a disaster. I'm living proof of it. There's people in the audience that can back me up on this, I can assure you. The other piece of data I just want to put up in front of you is the UK data, and I think this is an incredible data set. I've been very fortunate to work with Dairyco several times over the years, and I know there's a number of people in the audience that have seen this slide from me before. The average farmer in the UK, the average spring calving, seasonal calving, simple system in the UK has to milk about 140 cows to earn the average national wage, identical to Ireland. The top 25% have to milk 50. Again, very, very similar to Ireland. If you take the top farmers in the more complex, high input, high output system, again, the top 25% have to milk 50 cows. The top farmers can manage any system, there's no question about it, but the average have to milk 400. The difference between a simple system and a complex system. But of course, none of us are average. Nobody ever wants to be categorized as average. Unfortunately, the truth is 50% of us are worse than average. None of you, of course. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to finish off with 2 very quick slides. So I want to back up Mike's messages. I think they're absolutely poignant, and they need to be supported, and you need to dwell on them. And I'm sure his paper and Con's paper from tomorrow are excellent in providing this sum up. But you need to define what are your goals. Just because the government wants an extra 50% of milk, they also want your water to be charged. Just because they want another 50% of milk doesn't mean you have to supply it. If it doesn't suit your business, if it doesn't suit your goals. And remember, your goals need to be joined. It's a very, very lonely journey if you're following your goals and they're not supported by your spouse or partner or family in general. Expansion won't necessarily increase your profit. Past utilization, as Michael talked about, is the key. But I really want you to answer that question for yourself. How many cows do you need to milk? You've only one family to feed. And I'd use a sailing cliche. You need to trade a little speed for direction. Quotas will be gone in 2016, and they'll be gone in 2017, and they'll be gone in 2018. You don't have to achieve endgame in 2015. So to finish off, I want you to leave you with 3 quotes from probably the world's greatest philosopher, who is unfortunately only listened to by children. Today, you are you, that is truer than true. There is no one alive that is youer than you. This is your journey. You have to make the decision as to where you're going to go for your best interest, for your family's best interest. Don't be listening to anybody else and setting, well, I won't say don't listen to anybody else and setting your own goals, but set your own goals. Why fit in when you were born to stand out? Don't be a sheep. Just because everybody else is expanding doesn't mean you need to. Or just because everybody else is going to double cow numbers doesn't mean you need to. Maybe 10% more cows will actually achieve your end game. You have brains in your head, you have feet in your shoes, you can steer yourself any direction you choose. The choice is yours, ladies and gentlemen, and I look forward to seeing you all through the next couple of years and watching the story of your expansion. Thank you.